You weren't here on Friday, but what Leona talked about and what we discussed on Friday Family Bible Study was really good and really powerful. And a lot of what she had brought up kind of brought me into this word and what God has me to talk about for tonight. And kind of piggybacks a little bit of what she was going with. So I have it titled as, am I really supposed to love my enemies? And it's a question. Am I really supposed to love my enemies? To the answer of which is yes. Right? We really are supposed to love our enemies. Now, I don't know about you, but that can seem impossible. How in the world can you love someone who doesn't love you back? How in the world can you love someone who wants to do harm to you or to just tear you down and speak in harmful ways to you? How do you want to love them back? It's much easier for me to love people who already love me. It's much easier to surround myself around people that I know love me, and it's easy. It's almost like hitting the easy button in some way. For an example, I have no problem with loving my wife. Loving Kelsey is very easy. We got married because we love each other. We enjoy being with another. Kelsey is genuinely interested in who I am as a person. And believe it or not, after 4 years of marriage, I still want to impress her because what she thinks about me is important to me. Right? I don't have any trouble loving my children. They're a part of who I am. I take care of them and have a genuine interest in seeing them grow up to be good, godly men. Now there are times when we all get on each other's nerves. I don't know if it's everybody else, but I believe that's to be true. There are times when we have arguments and fight with one another. At the end of the day, we still love each other. I know, especially with the boys can have moments where they get very argumentative with each other and they fight, and no matter how much fun they're having together at one moment, the next moment they're fighting over the Xbox controller, they're fighting over who gets to control the TV and what have you, and they argue, and they may even say mean things to each other, stuff they really don't mean in that moment, but at the end of the day, they know that they love each other. They know that for a fact. But Jesus comes along and tosses in a monkey wrench of saying that not only are we to love those who love us, but we're also to love those who don't love us. Many of us will read this here in a moment and say, really, are you kidding? Because for some of us it's harder to grasp that. Late one summer evening in Nebraska, a weary-looking truck driver pulled his rig into an all-night truck stop. The waitress had just served him when three tough-looking leather-jacket motorcyclists, kind of like the Hells Angels type men, decided to give him a hard time. Not only did they verbally abuse him, one grabbed his hamburger off his plate, another took a handful of his French fries, and the third picked up his coffee and he drank it. If something like that were to happen in your situation, or if you were that truck driver in that moment, how would you respond in that exact moment? Well, the trucker did not respond in one that we may expect. Instead, he calmly rose, picked up his check, walked to the front of the room, put the check and his money on the cash register, and then went out the door. The waitress followed him to put the money into the till, and then stood watching out the door as the big truck just drove away into the night. And when she returned, one of the bikers said to her, "Well, he's not much of a man, is he?" She replied, "I don't know about that, but he sure ain't much of a truck driver. He just ran over 3 motorcycles on his way out of the parking lot." Which kind of sounds like justice when you first read that, or you first hear that. When someone wrongs us, our first instinct is to get them back. our first instinct is to make them hurt as much as they hurt us. This is the world's answer to being wronged. But Jesus gives his followers a different response they're to have. He tells us we're to love our enemies. Today in the passage that we're going to discuss in the book of Luke, we're going to see Jesus sharing with his followers how they're supposed to respond to those who are their enemies. Well, some of you might think, I don't have to worry about this because I don't have any enemies.
You can't say that in this room.
Right? But at some point in our lives, I mean, there are times, even in my life, that I can honestly go through and say, I don't have any true enemies in this moment. It's typically very, very short-lived, but I've been in that place where I genuinely didn't think I had anybody who had some hatred towards me or there was an enemy type of feeling. But all in all, throughout our daily lives, we're going to have, at some point, enemies in our lifetime. It's just unfortunate that's going to be the case. But the question becomes, how are you going to respond to people like that? Well, Jesus answers that question for us today. So if you have your Bibles with you, just turn to the book of Luke, chapter 6, verse 27. You can share with Muffy if you want.
I'm just going to listen to you read.
Oh, okay. But I say to you, here, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, and pray for those who spitefully use you. To him who strikes you on one cheek, offer the other also. And from him who takes away your cloak, do not withhold your tunic either. Give to everyone who asks of you, and from him who takes away your goods, do not ask them for them back. And just as you want men to do to you, you also do them likewise. So the question and all that I think we're going to answer here is how am I to respond to my enemies? Jesus shares us 3 responses. They're pretty plain insight there to how we're supposed to respond to our enemies. And the first response is do good things who hate you. The first response is do good things to those who hate you.
I heard something else too, and I was like, wait, what?
I apologize. So I don't think it's too hard to imagine this was a teaching that was totally foreign to the society of this day. But it's even foreign to our society as well. But even the religious leaders were confused by this teaching of Jesus, which kind of baffles me. The rabbis were teaching it at this time, back at that time, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. Which, when you read it, it kind of almost flows off the tongue and it kind of makes sense. My guess is most of us would be pretty good at following that law. But you know what? It doesn't take any supernatural power to do that. Jesus says in verse 32, if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And so when you kind of wrap your mind kind of around that part of it, it makes a lot more sense. At least it did for me. When Jesus calls us to love those who hate us, he's calling us to do something that's totally contrary to our human nature. Human nature tells us to get revenge. Or society burns it into our minds to get revenge. It tells us when someone messes with us, we're going to lay down the hammer down back on them. The thought is if we get back at them, they'll know not to mess with us anymore. Plus we think that revenge is sweet. That it's going to make us feel better. But guess what? Hatred is a horrible tool that literally destroys us. It destroys us physically. Scientific studies have found that hatred causes damage to us physically. Anger causes your blood pressure and breathing rate to increase, which can cause strain onto your heart or cause early heart attacks. It'll also trigger headaches and lead to abusive behavior. It can break down your immune system. That causes you to be more susceptible to diseases. Hatred also can destroy you emotionally. I know I've been there. It wears you down and makes your judgment less effective, leading to bad decision making. Oftentimes, the result of hatred is outbursts that can cause us to be embarrassed. This can lead to feelings of guilt and depression. Another side effect of always being angry and having intense hatred is that not many people really want to be around you. And what does that do to you emotionally when nobody wants to be around you? And then, of course, hatred can really get at you spiritually. We're told throughout the Bible that the essence of God is love. And if we're harboring hatred in our hearts, then we're living contrary or opposite to God's command to love each other. The result of that is, I believe, just a disconnect from God. Psalm 66:18 says, "If I have sin in my heart, God will not hear me." Because there are probably a lot of us who feel disconnect from God, who feel distant from God because we're harboring things in our lives that aren't supposed to be there. So I thought about this a lot, and just in my own everyday life is when I feel that disconnect or I feel a lack of emotional connection with God. There's a lot of factors that can come into that, but I know for a fact in some cases because I've got things harboring inside of me of hatred or anger of some sort towards someone else, so that's taking up all the of area that is supposed to be obviously for love. Have you ever noticed when you're angry at someone, it becomes your entire focus? It doesn't matter what's going on around you, your thoughts and focuses are totally upon the person who's wronged you, and you become trapped in that hatred to where it's hard to even function properly as a person and as a follower of God. I find it very, very challenging when I've got anger built up inside and hatred, when I've got the disconnect feeling of what's going on with God, and then God puts into my pathway somebody who can seem lost or somebody who I believe God has probably put them into my pathway to lead them to Christ in some way, shape, or form, or to lift up God in some way, and I don't, or I can't. I'm not focused anywhere on why God put them in my path. It's more, this person's in my way. I'm focused on something else that has me baffled. So how can we gain freedom from being imprisoned by anger? Jesus said it's by doing good to those who hate you. One thing that we have control over is how we're going to respond. And if you make the choice to respond to those who hate you, to those who are angry at you, by doing good to them, you're going to diffuse that tense situation. For one, it'll totally confuse the one that hates you because they're expecting you to respond in an angry way, especially if you are that short-tempered person or short-fused person, that you'll throw them completely off and kind of put them in this, wait, what's going on, type of mentality. It'll also diffuse some of the anger that they have towards you. It's really hard for someone to continue to hate you when you do them good. Kindness and love change people. There's the old saying, kill them with kindness. You know, it's a simple term. I don't know who said it, or who started it, or who brought it up, but I say it extremely often because it has real meaning to it. You overpower them with kindness and love, but it's got to be genuine. It cannot be a superficial way of saying, "Oh, I love you," but really, you still have that anger and you still have that hatred towards that person. There's a Watchman Nee who told a story at a Chinese Exxon man who owned a rice paddy next to his. This is another one of these I found in the Reader's Digest in case you wanted to go back and read this story again. The Zion man irrigated his paddy by pumping water out of a canal. Every day after the Zion had pumped through enough water to fill his paddy, the communist man would come out, remove the boards that kept the water in his neighbor's paddy and allow the water to drain into his paddy so he wouldn't have to pump the water. All in all, he's saying he's keeping water going into his neighbor's to make sure his was okay. This continued for some time until the Zion was fed up with it. He prayed, Lord, if this keeps up, I'm going to lose all my rice, maybe even my field. What can I do? The Lord responded by putting this thought into his mind. The next morning, the Zion man got up early and started pumping water into his neighbor's paddy first. Then he replaced the boards and pumped the water into his own rice paddy. The result is both rice paddies became productive, and the communist man was moved by his neighbor's moving action. The two men became friends, and eventually the communist found Jesus.
That's cool.
In practice, here's what it would kind of mean for us. So I kind of wanted to put it into terms that we kind of deal with on a regular basis. Mowing the lawn of your hateful neighbors. You've got this neighbor that maybe you just don't get along with for whatever reason. They don't wave back to you and that really offends you. Something. You go mow their lawn without them knowing, without them seeing you do it, or whatever the case may be. Volunteering to fill in for your mean-spirited coworker who drives you nuts. We've all had that coworker at work who just drives us bonkers, never takes anybody else's shift, but always is asking for other people to take their shift. Be the first one to jump out and say, you know, I'll take care of that for you. I'll cover it for you. Being helpful and kind to an ex-spouse or an ex-boyfriend or an ex-friend that maybe you've parted ways from in a friendship ways, but be helpful to them in some way. It may mean providing for a parent who was mean to you as you were growing up. If you had a parent that just you had a disconnect with and you had some anger or hatred with the parent who was growing up. But this is what it means to do good to those who hate you. If you do these things, you'll be surprised by the freedom that you'll feel from not feeling. I know. No. All right. From not feeling worn down or brought down by energy because you've got all that hatred and anger that's built up towards those who have been mean to you. You may even be surprised by the impact that you may have on the life of that enemy person, of whoever that may be. Abraham Lincoln said, he destroyed his enemies by loving them. How many enemies have you destroyed like that? To reiterate, the first response you're going to have towards your enemies is to do good to those who hate you. The second response you're going to have towards your enemies is this: bless those who curse you. He says that in verse 28. To bless those who curse you. So we've all heard the phrase, sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt me. Well, I'm here to say that that's not true. It's an absolute lie. There aren't too many things that carry more power in this life than the way that we communicate with one another. And sometimes it's not the words we say, it's how we say that. We all receive the same sentence in many different facets, many different ways. That's why I really still struggle with the whole text messaging things to communicate things, because there's no emotion that's tied behind that text message. You can say a simple sentence that means that you really are sorry that they can't make it to the ball. Because we all go to balls these days, right?
That's what we do.
That's what we do. But if you text that, then the person could receive it and say, and think you're being sarcastic and say, you're being a jerk.
That's why there's emojis, Joe. I'm sorry.
The emojis don't make any sense. To me. To me. To other people, I'm sure it does. The Bible tells us over and over again the great power that's in our speech. Unfortunately, it's much easier for us to use our speech in a negative way rather than a positive way. It's much easier to lash out at people than it is to use your speech to lift them up. Except for, again, those who you surround yourself with on purpose that love you, you love them. It's very easy to lift them up, or it's much easier to lift them up than it is to those who hate you or despise you. But when we choose to use our speech to lash out at people who've harmed us or hurt our feelings, all we're doing is throwing gas on a fire. All we're doing is rubbing salt in a wound. And we all know what happens when you rub salt into a wound, or Bactine, if anybody still uses Bactine. What does it do? It stings. It hurts. It typically causes a bad reaction. That's one reason Jesus tells us that one of the best ways to respond to our enemies is by blessing them. Kind speech is a very good way of working as a salve to heal wounds in people's lives. Proverbs 12:18. Reckless words pierce like a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. Can you think of an example in your life when someone said something to you that brought encouragement to you, that brought hope to you? Almost, I can think of numerous times. And it certainly helped in the time when I needed it. Some of you may have experienced the wonderful joy of making a mistake that you knew would cause your spouse to be angry with you. But instead of responding in anger, they came up to you and said, "I love you." Isn't it great when that response comes back to you and you're expecting this lashing back of, "I can't believe you did that. You forgot to do, the chores I gave you this list to do, and you chose to sleep all day." And you're expecting that response to be there. When they get home and you say, "Hey, I didn't do anything. I had to sleep. I was lazy." And they say, "I love you. It's okay. Let's work on that together now." What a difference that would be. It totally changes your mood. It causes you to put down your defense mechanisms and just relax and communicate. As a matter of fact, a kind word, a word of encouragement can actually remove the anger a person has towards you. Proverbs 15:1. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. I really believe most of us probably would have fewer enemies if we learned how to speak in a way that built people up instead of tearing them down. Harsh words put people in a fighting mood. Kind words will really soften their spirit. Now, this is strange because coming from an extreme non-confrontational person of who I am, so as I'm reading through this and studying this, I'm going, okay, well, this doesn't apply to me. I don't lash out at people. I don't use my words so often in an anger way towards people. But I kind of do the exact opposite, which also hurts people when there's no words that are spoken or silence is there and you're ignoring them. It can mean the exact same thing. I'm not giving any words of encouragement when I'm speaking to someone, when I'm angry with them. So another example is a Christian lady owned 2 prized chickens that got out of the run, buried themselves in the garden of the lady's rather grouchy neighbor. So I kind of thought of our neighbor who has chickens, imagining it going into the neighbor's backyard and burying themselves back in there. And those neighbors aren't necessarily the nicest within our little cul-de-sac. So this really kind of hit home when I was thinking about this. The man was upset when he saw the 2 hens, so he ran out, caught the hens. It's pretty difficult to do, but he was able to do that evidently. And he wrung their necks and threw them back over the fence. As you can imagine, the woman was pretty upset. But she avoided her urge to get angry and rush over and scream at the man, which I think any of us probably would have done in our first reactions. Instead, she took the birds, dressed them out, prepared them, and she made 2 chicken pot pies. Then she delivered one of the freshly baked pies to the man who had killed her hens. When she handed him the chicken pot pie, she apologized to him for not being more careful about keeping her chickens in her own yard, her children, expecting an angry scene, hid behind the bush around the corner to kind of get an idea of what his reaction was going to be, what he would say. But the man was absolutely speechless. The chicken pie and apology filled him with a burning sense of shame, and he apologized to her of how he overreacted. Next time you see a person who just automatically ticks you off, think of a kind word or deed to share with him.
Sorry. Keep going.
And do it because you want to be more like Jesus. Don't do it because, oh, Joe was talking about this, and so the next time somebody really ticks me off, I better say something nice to them. Don't do it just because.
That's right.
You need to do it because you want to be more like Jesus, because Jesus is telling us to do so. Right? And I think you'll be surprised by how good you feel for doing it, and surprised by how the person reacts. And I'll assure you, if you're doing it just to do it, you probably won't get the reaction you're expecting. Mm-hmm. So again, to reiterate, the first response you'd have towards your enemies is to do good to those who hate you. The second was to bless those who curse you. The final and third one to have towards your enemies is pray for those who mistreat you. Verse 28 talks about that. How? Have you discovered that those people who mistreat you have a way of dominating your thoughts?
Come on. That's right.
Right? Not only do they physically abuse you, but they can also mentally abuse you, because it's hard to get our minds off of what they've done to us. Have you ever been there before? I can think of times when people have wronged me, and instead of just moving on, I dwelt on what they did to me, and it just consumed my thoughts. It made me miserable, and I got tired of being dominated by them in my mind. And again, I wouldn't speak about it. I just would keep it within inside. Let it dwell inside of me. And it consumed me, but I convinced myself that I'm just going to tuck it away and I don't have to worry about it. If I don't talk about it, it's not there. Right? But it truly consumes you in a not such good way. Well, Jesus has a solution to that problem for us. Do you know what it is? It's to pray. Pray for those who mistreat you. Now, before you get excited, Jesus is not talking about us praying for our enemy to get run over by a truck. He's not talking about us praying for revenge upon our enemies. Completely different. He's referring us praying for their hearts to be changed. You see, too often we waste our time dealing with symptoms instead of dealing with the cause. For example, if we stay up late and we don't get much sleep, and we're up all night. Case in point, Lakaya right now, who stayed up really late last night, and then he went swimming all day today. He was tired. He's exhausted. He's irritable. He's easily irritable. Where I get extremely irritable when I don't get enough sleep. Sometimes. Enough sleep is debatable. But I do feel myself more short-tempered or easily angered or shorter fused if I'm going off of very, very, very little sleep for a long period of time. So what do I do when that's the case? I'll drink some caffeine. I'll get enough coffee to get through me. I'll drink enough Mountain Dew. I'll avoid loud music or loud noises to keep my headache from consuming me. But all I'm doing is I'm treating the symptoms, not the cause. What I really need to do is just go to bed earlier, and that'll eliminate my problems, plus the caffeine and all the sugar and diabetes that I'm causing. And typically we do the same thing with our enemies. We see them being rude to us. We see them doing things they know will make us upset. And we deal with the problem by yelling at them or by, ignore them. But to respond in that manner is only to deal with the symptoms of the problem. The best thing we can do is to pray for them. to pray that God will deal with their heart and bring them change, to pray that God will deal with our own heart, not to be irritated with them, and for our hearts to be softened as well. And I also have been praying, please don't harden my heart. Keep my heart from getting hardened. Your prayers for your enemies can actually serve as a tool to keep you from being destroyed by bitterness and anger. And your prayers can also serve as a net to salvage you from being controlled by your feelings. During the building of the Golden Gate Bridge over San Francisco Bay, which is back, I think, when Muffy was growing up, construction fell badly behind schedule because several workers had accidentally fallen from the scaffolding to their deaths. Do you remember that?
I don't.
You don't?
Funny.
Funny how that is. So engineers and administrators could find no solution to the costly delays. Believe it or not, they couldn't find out why these people kept falling off and dying. Again, this was
Gravity.
many moons ago. Gravity is a tough thing to capture, I guess. So finally, someone suggested a gigantic net be hung under the bridge to catch anyone who fell. After it was installed, progress was hardly interrupted. A worker or two had fallen, but the net had saved their lives. The net allowed them to move on in their work without fear or worry. Prayer is just like that net. It keeps us from going over the edge in anger. Communication with God can take the sting out of our hatred and anger towards people. That's good to know because in this section of Scripture we see one of the hardest commands, I believe, that Jesus gives to us, is to love your enemies. It's so hard to do, but we've been called to do it because that's what Jesus has done for us. And sometimes when I think, okay, love your enemies, that's easy to do. Because God calls us to love everyone. I'm going to love everyone. Love my neighbor. But when someone really hurts you, someone really affects you in some way, I'm pointing over there because that's where Leona was on Friday night. She was talking about that. If you were dealing with someone who had killed your son or your daughter or your best friend or your spouse, something very terrible, I don't think it's that easy to still just love your enemy. Just wake up and be like, I still love you. It's okay. Now, I believe you can work real hard to get there, and it takes time to get there, and prayerfully you will get there because you desire to do so, and God is teaching us, and God works with us to get there. But it's not as easy as just loving someone who hasn't hurt you or hasn't done wrong to you or to anyone of your family. Do you realize that it's in our nature to be at odds with God, to be His enemy? But in spite of that fact, Jesus has sought out to love us anyway. In Romans 5:8, in that while we were sinners, Christ died for us. You want your life to be better? You want to get people's attention? If you really want to grab people's attention, and when I say grabbing their attention, I don't mean grab attention to get focused onto you so that you shine and you light up against everybody else. But if you want to grab their attention in ways that they can see Jesus in you, which I think is important, simply love people. Love all people, whether they be your friends or your enemies. Ephesians 4:32, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as Christ God forgave you. When you and I leave here today, the question for us is going to be, how are we going to respond to our enemies? For followers of Jesus, we've been given 3 responses to have towards our enemies. Do good to those who hate us. Bless those who curse us. And finally, just pray for those who mistreat you. Let me ask you a question. Can you think of someone who's mistreated you? Someone who's done you wrong?
No.
If you can, put into practice what we've talked about today. I know that sounds impossible, and I want you to know it is in your own power. But with God's involvement, all things are possible. If someone at work is always smarting off to you, respond to them tomorrow by giving them a word of encouragement. If one of your family members says hateful things to you, start praying that God would heal their heart. And pray for the Lord to allow love to well up in your heart for that family member. Ask God to show you ways that you can demonstrate love to your enemies. Remember, a kind word turns away wrath. But most importantly, loving your enemies demonstrates in a powerful way that you belong to Jesus Christ. Amen.